Good morning, class. And it's nice talking to you again once more. Today, I feel like there's so much for us to do this week. So I'm starting early. Today is the Martin Luther King's birthday. So I'm home and I'm not going anywhere. So I want to first talk to you about news values. Some of you may have wondered, how do newspapers or TV news or radio news or even internet news decide what news should be reported and what news should not be reported? There's always a debate, and some people decide that some news are more liberal and some news are more conservative, and what qualifies as news for one organization may not qualify as news for a different one. I think what is important for you all to understand is that, of course, there are going to be biases. Of course, there are going to be preferences of the editor or the people in charge. But there are some basic values that everyone recognizes as being critical to selecting what is news and what isn't. Okay, so um, so looking at the screen, you see that we talk about news values at the basic categories that help journalists define what makes news and what doesn't. Um, so the factors that determine what makes it into the news and what doesn't, they're called news values. Some people call them the criteria for newsworthiness. They are subjective sometimes and dependent on what the editor prefers and what isn't. This is going to be relevant to you in this class because I always prefer that the student chooses his or her own stories. I don't like to tell you what to write about. I will give you the general categories. For instance, I may ask you to write a story about, let's say this week with the inauguration, to take a local angle, write about the inauguration. For example, there may be some people having inauguration parties. There may be protests going on in your communities about the inauguration. There may be people who are holding screening parties for the inauguration, or just organizations that are doing an event related to the inauguration. It's going to be up to you to decide exactly what event you want to attend, as long as you do cover an event. So um, you will then decide, is this newsworthy? And you're going to be using the criteria that we're going to talk about today in helping you make that determination. So again, it's very difficult to define what is news. Geography plays a big part in it. For example, what is news in Fresno, California isn't going to be news in New York City. What is news in even Sacramento, California may not be so important to people who live in Fresno. So geography is very important. News is when man bites a dog. I used to find that so funny when I was in college, and my professor would say to us that if a dog bites a man, there's nothing about that. We expect that dogs would bite. But if a man bites a dog, there is something to that story. We have to wonder if the man is crazy, if there are other circumstances, and therefore that makes it newsworthy. News is something that we haven't heard about before, and that talks about timeliness. For example, we all know that Donald Trump was elected president on November 8th last year. That's not news anymore. Everyone has heard it. Okay, we've all have heard lots of stories about people that he nominated for the different positions in his government. That's not news anymore. If, for instance, today he decides that he will no longer support the nomination of, let's say, Jeff Sessions for the Attorney General. That is news. Why? Because it's new, because we hadn't heard about it. This is the first time that we're hearing about it. So news is also very, very important in terms of your audience. It's all determined by what your audience likes to read, what they like to hear, what they like to see on television. So they are at the key of your definition of what news is supposed to be. So questions that you have to ask yourself is, so who is reading my newspaper or my magazine, or who is watching my television program or listening to me on the radio? What does the reader want and need from me? What is your goal? How do you achieve, these goals change? Because goals change with time, they're not fixed. What values make something interesting anyway? So the first criterion in determining what is news is going to be timeliness. How timely is it? Is it a recent development or is it old news? The more recent it is, the more likely it is to make the news. Proximity. Is it close to you? Is it relevant to your local readers? The closer an event, the more relevant it is to your readers. Impact. How many people are impacted by the event or by the news that you're considering? Let's take, for instance, this debate on the Republicans possibly eliminating the Affordable Care Act. Is it news? Absolutely. Because of the mere fact that millions and millions of people will be impacted by it. Okay? Again, let's take something such as the march that is taking place in many, many cities throughout the nation on January 21st, which is Saturday. Is it going to be about impact? Yes. It's about impact because millions and millions of people are participating, and millions of people believe that it affects them or it impacts them in one way or the other. So the question in considering an impact is, what effect will the story have on readers? The more impact a story has, the more its impact on the readers. Prominence. I don't know if you recognize that picture, but that was the mayor, the last mayor of Fresno, Ashley Swearingen. If a prominent person is involved in the news, yes, then it is important. If it's just your regular person like you or me, who cares? Absolutely. So if, for instance, Arnold Schwarzenegger says something, he's now, I think, the executive producer of The Apprentice, the show that Donald Trump used to be the producer of. If either of these two personalities say anything or do anything, we're bombarded by it. But if your typical person does exactly the same thing, your reader does not seem to be very, very interested in it. Unusualness. When something that is unusual happens, readers want to read about it. When a dog bites a man, it's common. and an everyday thing, but when a man bites a dog, people want to know about it. Okay, so let's think of some of the unusual things that have been on the news lately. For example, the election of Donald Trump. It's quite unusual. When was the last time that a man who had never been in politics, who had never held an office, was elected to the highest office in the country? Okay, what about some of the things that he's been doing, like going on Twitter and tweeting things and insults at people? That's not something that we usually associate with the presidency. So that's quite unusual. What about the quality of the people that he is nominating? Also unusual. And you also think of the stories that surround him about the so-called golden showers, etc., etc. These are all unusual stories. I don't recall ever uh, reading about any such things with past presidents. So, and that is why a lot of these things are being covered in the news. So we go on to the next one. Value 6, conflict. Every time there's a conflict, again, look at the election that we just had. There's people to the right who supported Trump and people to the left who supported Hillary Clinton. The conflict doesn't end just because there's been an election. It's going to be ongoing. But also think about other events, other things. There's a car accident. There's a conflict. Two people, two opposing views, 2 points of views, probably two different experiences. We look at healthcare, two views, absolutely. There really isn't much in life that doesn't have conflict. Okay. And then we go on to human interest. Okay, sometimes there are stories about people who are resilient, people who have succeeded even with incredible odds, people who have done amazing things, people who take in the homeless, who devote their time to helping people who have nothing, people who give up their Wall Street jobs and devote the rest of their lives to helping the poor. A woman who's been on welfare but goes through college, becomes a college professor, a child who was abandoned at birth, who ends up becoming the president of a Fortune 500 company. These are all human interest stories. They are the kinds of stories that tug at our heartstrings. People love to read about other people who have overcome a lot of odds. And if you find such stories, they are always very, very interesting. And people like to read about them. Okay. So remember them. There are 7 news values: impact, timeliness, proximity, human interest, prominence, novelty, and conflict. When you go out there to find your stories to write, ask yourself, do these stories have at least one of these values? Chances are that you're going to find 3 or more values in any story assignment or any story that you do. So what I want you to do is, there is an assignment that's related to news value, and the assignment wants you to find 5 news stories on the cover of any newspaper. And of course, because you're going to be getting your stories online, they don't have to be necessarily on the cover, but when you analyze them, make sure that you explain the news values that you find present in each of the stories. And also, please include the link to the story, to each explanation, so that I too can go look at the story and decide if you're right, if you got all the values, or if you're missing some of them. Again, with any others, with all the assignments and all the lectures, please feel free to call or to email me or send me a message through any means possible, and I will be more than willing to explain or to get back to you as soon as possible. Have a nice day.